The night was soaked in rain. Streets glistened beneath the glow of blurred headlights, and the echo of distant thunder rolled through the city like a warning. Somewhere on that slick highway, a young man named Daniel was driving home, humming a tune under his breath, his guitar resting in the back seat after another night playing at a small cafe. He was 28 years old, full of dreams, full of laughter, full of life. But that night, fate had other plans. The accident happened in seconds. A flash of headlights, the screech of tires, and the violent impact of steel against steel. His car spun, glass shattering like raindrops turned to knives, until finally it slammed against the guardrail, twisted and broken. When the world went silent, Daniel lay unconscious behind the wheel, his body battered, his breathing shallow. Sirens screamed through the storm as paramedics rushed to pull him from the wreckage. At the hospital, chaos unfolded. Doctors and nurses surrounded him, their voices sharp and urgent. Machines beeped, fluids were pushed, and his lifeless body was stabilized only by the miracle of modern medicine. His family arrived soon after, faces pale, eyes wide with terror, as they heard the words no one ever wants to hear. He's alive, but in a coma. The sterile ICU room became his new world. White walls, flickering monitors, the steady hum of oxygen, the soundtrack of survival. His mother sat at his bedside, her hand wrapped around his motionless fingers, whispering prayers into the silence. "Come back to me, Daniel," she murmured, night after night, as if her voice could bridge the distance between life and the abyss. Doctors were less hopeful. They explained with clinical detachment that after such trauma, waking was unlikely. Even if he did, the man they loved might never be the same. Words like vegetative state and irreversible damage lingered in the air like poisonous smoke. Still, his family refused to let go. They clung to faith, to music, to the memory of the boy who once filled every room with song. As days turned into weeks, Daniel's room became a place of ritual. His friends brought his guitar, strumming softly in the corner, hoping familiar chords could reach him. His mother read aloud his favorite books, her voice breaking but steady. Some nights, she simply cried beside him, her tears dampening the bedsheets. Through it all, Daniel lay silent, a fragile body kept alive by machines, but with a heart that refused to stop beating. Outside the hospital walls, life moved on. Seasons changed, people hurried past with their own burdens, unaware of the young man trapped between worlds in room 14. Inside, however, time felt frozen. Every small sound, the beeping of monitors, the rustle of nurses' shoes, the sigh of ventilators, became a reminder of how thin the thread of life truly was. And yet, even in silence, something lingered. Nurses whispered that sometimes his fingers twitched when music played. Others swore they saw his eyelids flicker when his mother sang. Doctors dismissed these as reflexes, meaningless spasms of a broken body. But his mother? She believed. She looked into his still face, brushed his dark hair from his forehead, and whispered again and again, "I know you're in there, Daniel. Don't give up." No one in that sterile room could have imagined what the future held. They couldn't know that 6 months later, against every prediction, Daniel's eyes would open, and the first words that left his lips would make even hardened doctors cry. Before the accident, Daniel was not just another young man. He was the kind of soul who seemed to brighten every room he entered. He carried an old acoustic guitar everywhere he went, the wood worn from countless songs played under streetlights, in quiet cafes, and at family gatherings. His music wasn't about fame or recognition, it was about connection. When he sang, people stopped and listened. His laughter was just as memorable, loud, contagious, the kind that pulled others in like gravity. Daniel's friends often joked that he had a song for everything. If someone was heartbroken, he strummed a ballad that made their pain feel less lonely. If someone celebrated, he played a melody so joyful that the whole room clapped along. Music was his language, his way of leaving fingerprints on the hearts of others. But behind that joy, Daniel carried dreams that stretched far beyond the small cafes where he performed. He wanted to record an album, to tour small towns, to show the world that music could heal even the deepest wounds. He scribbled lyrics in old notebooks, fragments of poetry filled with raw emotion. His mother found some of those notebooks after the accident, tucked away in his room. The ink smudged, but still alive with his voice. Now those notebooks sat in silence, just like him. His friends often gathered around his bed, strumming his guitar softly, reading his lyrics aloud as though trying to remind him of who he was. They whispered stories of late-night adventures, laughter by bonfires, and the promises of a future he had yet to live. Even in his stillness, Daniel remained the centerpiece of their lives. And yet, the contrast was crushing. The vibrant, joyful young man they all loved was now a silent figure, motionless beneath white hospital sheets. His once calloused fingers, the same fingers that danced over guitar strings, now lay limp against the bed. For his family, the image was almost unbearable. His mother sat for hours, stroking his hand, whispering memories into the void. His father, quieter, but equally broken, stood by the window at times, hiding his tears from the others. It was in those moments of grief that his friends began to realize something profound. Daniel had never been just Daniel. He was their reminder of joy, their anchor of hope, the voice that reminded them to keep living even in difficult times. Losing him, even to silence, felt like losing a part of themselves. That's why no one gave up. Not his mother, not his father, not the friends who kept showing up week after week. They believed that somewhere deep inside, he could still hear them, still feel the love that surrounded him. Maybe, just maybe, that love would reach him where medicine could not. And if you believe in stories like this, if you believe that hope, love, and miracles can defy even the darkest odds, this is the perfect moment to support this journey. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share the story with others who need a reminder that miracles do exist. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible stories to life. Because Daniel's story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The accident had stolen his voice, but the love of those around him would become the melody that carried him through the silence. And one day, against all odds, that silence would break. The hospital soon became a second home for Daniel's family. Days bled into nights, nights into weeks, and still he lay in silence. His mother refused to leave his side. She arrived every morning with a small bag containing his favorite book, a framed photo of him holding his guitar, and a notebook where she wrote daily letters addressed to him. She would sit beside his bed, reading them aloud, her voice trembling but steady. "Today the rain stopped, Daniel. Today I remembered how you laughed when we got caught in the storm that summer. Please, laugh again for me." The nurses admired her persistence. Some whispered that her devotion was both beautiful and heartbreaking. A quiet war fought against the silence of the coma. She would hold his hand for hours, stroking his fingers as though she could remind them of the strings they once played. Sometimes she sang to him, old songs he had loved as a child. Her voice was fragile, cracked by exhaustion, but filled with unwavering love. Friends rotated their visits, each trying to bring something of Daniel back into the sterile room. One friend brought his guitar, softly strumming the songs Daniel once played, hoping that music might reach him where words could not. Another friend played recordings of Daniel singing during open mic nights, his voice filling the room like a ghost from another life. His younger sister pinned his handwritten lyrics to the wall, turning the cold, white space into something that resembled a sanctuary. The doctors, however, remained cautious. They explained again and again that hearing is the last sense to fade, but that didn't mean he was truly aware. They used words like reflexes and false hope. Still, the family chose to believe. And every small flicker, every twitch of his hand, every subtle shift of his breathing was taken as proof that Daniel was still with us, fighting silently in the darkness. Time was merciless. Holidays passed, seasons changed, and the outside world moved on. Inside room 14, the clock seemed frozen. The steady beep of monitors marked the passing hours, a cruel rhythm that became both a comfort and a torment. Each new sunrise brought the same haunting question: would today be different? Would he wake? There were nights when despair nearly broke them. Her mother would sit in the dim light, her head bowed, whispering prayers that felt unanswered. She sometimes wondered if she was selfish to keep hoping, if letting go would be kinder. Yet, when she looked at him, when she saw the steady rise and fall of his chest, something inside her refused to surrender. She knew her son. She knew the fighter he was, and she believed he was still fighting, even if they could not see it. Friends often said the room felt alive when they were there together, filling it with stories and laughter in Daniel's honor. They recalled adventures, embarrassing moments, and promises for the future. They spoke to him as if he could answer, because somewhere deep inside, they believed he could. And though silence was his only reply, the love in that room grew stronger with every passing day. The waiting was agony. It was uncertainty stretched to its breaking point, a cruel test of patience and faith. But within that waiting, bonds deepened. His mother's love became unshakable. His friend's loyalty became unbreakable. Together, they wove a net of love strong enough to hold him, should he ever find the strength to return. And though no one could predict the future, one truth became clear. If Daniel ever opened his eyes again, he would awaken to a world that had refused to abandon him, a world that had waited, faithfully, through the silence. It was in the quiet hours of the night that the first signs appeared, small, almost invisible, like whispers in the dark. A nurse on the night shift noticed it first. She was adjusting the IV line when she swore she saw Daniel's fingers twitch. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than a reflex. Patients in comas often moved without meaning, their bodies responding to nerves rather than will. But something about the timing unsettled her. She had just been humming softly under her breath, an old tune she remembered hearing his mother sing earlier that day. And right then, his hand shifted. The nurses began keeping notes. Tiny changes, a flicker of his eyelids, a sudden alteration in breathing, a slight turn of his head. Each was small enough to ignore, but together they formed a pattern that was difficult to explain away. When his mother sang, the monitors showed subtle variations. When friends played his guitar beside him, his heart rate seemed to rise, as though echoing to the rhythm of the music. Doctors dismissed the observations. They reminded the family that the body is full of involuntary reflexes, that hope often tricks people into seeing meaning where none exists. "These are coincidences," one physician said gently. "It doesn't mean he is aware." But his mother refused to believe it was random. She had known her son his entire life. She knew his rhythms, his silences, the way his body carried his soul, and she was certain he was responding. One evening, as the rain tapped gently against the window, she leaned close to his ear and whispered, "Daniel, if you can hear me, give me a sign." For a moment, nothing happened, just the steady hum of machines and the quiet of the room. Then, ever so faintly, his fingers curled against hers. She gasped, her heart racing, tears welling in her eyes. Was it real, or was grief playing tricks on her again? She chose to believe it was real. Word spread quickly among the staff. Some scoffed, unwilling to bend science toward mystery. Others admitted in hushed voices that they had seen it too. A nurse swore he turned his head slightly when his sister read his lyrics aloud. Another insisted that he moved when a guitar chord was strummed, like a faint echo of memory. Soon, room 14 became a place of cautious wonder. For the family, these subtle responses became lifelines. They clung to every flicker, every twitch, as evidence that Daniel was still fighting. They began to speak more deliberately, filling his room with encouragement and love. His sister started each morning by saying, "Good morning, Daniel. We believe in you." His mother ended every night with, "I'll see you tomorrow. Don't leave me." These rituals, though simple, carried enormous weight. And yet, mystery lingered. Was Daniel truly aware, trapped inside a silent prison, or was his body just a shell, giving false hope to those who couldn't let go? Science demanded one answer, but the heart whispered another. The truth lay hidden, waiting in the shadows of time. Still, the signs grew stronger. His breathing shifted when music played. His eyelids fluttered more often, like a curtain trembling before lifting. The line between reflex and response began to blur, and though no doctor would admit it, whispers of miracle began circulating in the hallway. Something was happening, something beyond explanation, and those who loved him believed it with all their hearts. Because deep inside the silence, they were certain Daniel was listening. The room was quiet that afternoon, the kind of stillness that presses against the chest and makes every sound feel louder than it is. Rain tapped gently against the window, the soft rhythm filling the silence. Daniel's mother sat by his bed, weary but unwavering. In her hands, she held an old lullaby book, its cover frayed from years of use. She had sung these songs to him as a child when he was frightened by storms or couldn't sleep. Now, as she opened it and began to sing, her voice cracked with both love and exhaustion. The notes floated through the room, fragile but warm. Nurses passing by slowed their steps, drawn by the tenderness in her tone. For a while, nothing happened. The steady beeping of monitors continued, indifferent to her prayer and song. But then, something changed. His fingers moved. Not a twitch, not the random spasm the doctors had described so many times, but a deliberate curl around her hand. Her heart leapt. She froze, barely daring to breathe. Slowly, his eyelids fluttered. The monitors flickered, his heart rate climbing just enough to notice. She gasped, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Daniel! Daniel, are you there?" The nurse rushed in, eyes wide, calling for a doctor. Within moments, the room filled with staff. They surrounded the bed, watching the monitors, watching him. Doctors leaned close, shining lights into his eyes, testing his reflexes. But she knew. She knew this was not coincidence. Her son was answering her. The lullaby continued, though her voice trembled. With each note, his hand squeezed hers a little tighter, faint but unmistakable. The staff exchanged stunned looks. Some shook their heads, unwilling to admit the impossible, but others could not hide their awe. Something real was happening before their eyes. For his friends, it was the sign they had prayed for. When they arrived later and heard the story, they surrounded his bed, guitars in hand, and played his favorite song. Again, the monitors shifted. Again, his fingers twitched. Tears flowed freely around the room, as hope, once fragile, began to feel alive. Doctors cautioned them not to overinterpret. It may not mean consciousness, they insisted. But the family no longer listened. They had seen it, felt it. The boy who once filled their lives with music was answering through silence. It was the first crack in the wall that separated them, the first proof that love was reaching him. Moments like these are why stories like Daniel's matter. They remind us that even when science says no, love whispers yes. And if you believe in the power of love, in the strength of miracles, don't let this moment pass. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share the story. Together, we can keep spreading hope where it is needed most. Because that day was more than just a small twitch of the hand. It was a revelation, proof that Daniel was still there, hidden in the shadows, fighting to return. And though the road ahead would be long, for the first time since the accident, his family felt certain the silence would not last forever. The revelation had breathed new life into the family's hope, but it also came with a heavy truth. The road forward would not be easy. Awakening from a coma was not like opening a door and stepping into sunlight. It was more like crawling out of a deep, endless pit, inch by painful inch, without certainty of what would be found at the top. In the days that followed, Daniel's body gave small signals of awareness. A faint movement of the lips, a flicker of his eyes, the tightening of his hand when familiar songs played. These moments lifted spirits, but they were unpredictable. Sometimes they came, sometimes they vanished for days, leaving his loved ones crushed by doubt. His mother held his hand constantly, whispering encouragement. But even she admitted the fear that haunted her. What if the signs faded again? Doctors reminded them repeatedly, even if he woke fully, he might never be the same. Brain damage could leave him unable to speak, to walk, to play the guitar that had once been his soul. His future, they said, was uncertain. But the family ignored the grim warnings. They had seen him respond. That was enough to fight for. Still, the struggle was real. His body often betrayed him. Some days he seemed close to opening his eyes, only to fall back into stillness. Other times his breathing grew ragged and alarms echoed in the ICU. Nurses rushed in, stabilizing him while his mother stood frozen, heart pounding, praying silently for him to hold on. Every improvement felt fragile, like a candle flame flickering in the wind, always at risk of being snuffed out. The emotional toll was heavy. His sister broke down one night, confessing that she couldn't bear the waiting anymore. His father, quiet as always, simply put a hand on his shoulder and said, "We wait because he would wait for us." His friends, though cheerful in front of him, often left the hospital in tears, uncertain if they could keep watching the boy they knew fade into silence. But they returned, again and again. They strummed guitars, told stories, and filled the sterile room with echoes of life. His mother continued her rituals, reading his notebooks, singing his songs, holding his hand as if her strength could be borrowed. Though exhaustion weighed on her body, she refused to rest. If he's fighting, then so will I. And Daniel was fighting. Inside his motionless body, a battle raged. It was invisible to those watching, but in the depths of his silence, he clung to life. Each twitch, each flicker was a message. I am still here. Do not give up on me. The struggle was not just his. It belonged to all of them. To his mother, who refused to let go, to his sister, who read his lyrics aloud in a trembling voice, to his friends, who filled the room with music. Together, they carried him through the darkest days, even when the weight of despair pressed hardest. It was a war fought in silence, a war of love against hopelessness, of faith against science itself, of patience against time itself. And though they could not see the outcome, one truth remained clear. As long as he breathed, the fight was not over. It was early morning when it happened, one of those quiet hours when the hospital felt half asleep. The night shift was ending, the day shift was beginning, and the corridors echoed only with the distant squeak of carts and the muted chatter of nurses exchanging reports. In room 14, the steady beeping of the monitors was the only sound. Daniel's mother sat beside him as always, her head resting against his arm, whispering softly about the sunrise. For weeks, his body had been caught between silence and faint signals, twitches, flickers, tiny movements that teased hope but never gave resolution. The family had grown used to the agony of almosts. They prayed, they waited, they believed, but deep down, they feared the miracle might never come. And then, without warning, it did. His eyelids trembled. At first, it looked like another flicker, the kind the nurses had written down so many times. But this was different. Slowly, with effort that seemed to pull the very breath from him, Daniel's eyes opened. Just a sliver at first, then wider, until the sterile fluorescent lights above reflected in his gaze. Her mother froze, unsure if she was dreaming. Her heart hammered as she leaned forward, whispering his name. "Daniel? Can you see me?" The monitors spiked gently, responding to his change. His gaze shifted, searching, unfocused, but alive. And then, as if drawn by instinct, his eyes settled on her face. Recognition flickered across them, weak, fragile, but unmistakable. His lips trembled, though no sound came. Tears poured down his mother's cheeks as she cupped his face with shaking hands. "You came back to me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Within seconds, the room filled with nurses and doctors, called by the alarms and the commotion. They stood frozen at the sight, their clinical detachment stripped away by the weight of the moment. Some reached for charts, some adjusted machines, but most could not look away. Against all predictions, against every warning, the young man who had been gone for 6 long months had opened his eyes. Word spread quickly. Friends rushed to the hospital, their footsteps echoing in the halls as they came to witness what they had dreamed of for half a year. When they entered the room and saw Daniel's eyes open, they wept openly. One friend fell to his knees, pressing his palms together in prayer. Another leaned against the wall, covering his mouth to stifle his sobs. It felt less like medicine and more like a miracle. Daniel blinked slowly, struggling to adjust to the light. Every movement was small, deliberate, and exhausting, but each was monumental. His chest rose and fell unevenly, as if even breathing required tremendous effort. Yet none of that mattered. He was awake. He was here. For the family, it was the moment they had dreamed of, the moment they had clung to through sleepless nights and endless tears. His mother kissed his forehead, whispering again and again, "Thank you for coming back. Thank you." Doctors continued their tests, shining lights into his eyes, checking his reflexes, murmuring medical terms under their breath. But no explanation could overshadow what everyone felt in that room. They were witnessing something extraordinary, something that defied statistics, something that science alone could not define. The silence that had once weighed heavy on room 14 was broken. And though words had not yet come, though the battle was far from over, everyone present knew this was the miracle they had been waiting for. The hours after Daniel opened his eyes were filled with disbelief and quiet wonder. Nurses moved quickly to check his vitals. Doctors crowded the bedside with clipboards, and his family clung to his presence as though he might vanish again if they looked away. For months they had dreamed of this moment, yet when it finally arrived, it felt unreal, fragile, like a bubble that could burst at the slightest touch. Daniel's gaze wandered around the room. His eyes were heavy, his movements slow, but there was unmistakable awareness in them. He looked at the monitors, at the ceiling, at the shadows on the wall. Each glance seemed to demand more energy than he possessed, yet he pressed on, searching for something familiar. And then his eyes found hers, his mother, who had been waiting for this moment every single day. She leaned close, brushing the hair from his forehead, her tears falling freely. "I'm here, Daniel. I've always been here." His lips quivered. At first, it seemed like the faint tremble of effort, a struggle to breathe. But then, slowly, he tried to form a word. His throat tightened, his voice caught, and a weak rasp slipped into the air. The room fell silent. Nurses leaned closer, and his mother held her breath. The sound came again, barely audible, but real. His lips shaped a phrase, broken and faint, yet clear enough to hear. "I love you, Mom." Time seemed to stop. The words were simple, but their weight was immeasurable. The woman who had sung to him, prayed for him, refused to leave his side, was the first person he spoke to after 6 months of silence. Her sobs filled the room as she collapsed against his chest, whispering, "I love you too, I love you so much," again and again. Even the doctors who had spent their careers guarding themselves against emotion felt their throats tighten. A nurse wiped her eyes, pretending to check a machine. Another reached for his hand, squeezing it gently, as if to reassure him he wasn't alone. It was the kind of moment that tore down the walls between science and faith, between medicine and miracles. His friends arrived soon after and were told what had happened. When they entered the room, Daniel was exhausted, his eyes closing again from the effort. But his mother repeated his words to them, and they broke into tears. They crowded around the bed, telling him how much they loved him, how proud they were, how they had never stopped believing. Even if he could not speak again that day, he had already given them everything they needed, proof that he was still Daniel, still their son, their brother, their friend. The hospital room felt transformed. No longer was it a place of endless waiting and despair. It became sacred ground, a place where love had spoken louder than silence. Every person who entered carried the weight of what had been said, and every whisper in the halls carried the same refrain. He told her he loved her. For the family, it was the answer to their prayers. For the doctors, it was a phenomenon that defied explanation. And for Daniel, though he drifted back into sleep soon after, it was the first step back into a world that had refused to let him go. Waking was only the beginning. The doctors explained that coming out of a coma did not mean life would return to normal. Daniel's muscles had weakened after months of immobility. His speech was fragile, and his memory flickered in and out like a faulty light. The journey ahead would require months, maybe years of rehabilitation. But for his family, none of that mattered. He was alive. He was awake. And he was theirs again. The first days were the hardest. Daniel struggled even to lift a spoon, to form words beyond whispers, to move without exhaustion. Physical therapists guided his arms, teaching him again how to hold, how to grasp, how to push against gravity. Every movement was met with sweat and trembling. Speech therapists sat beside him, coaxing syllables, celebrating every small sound as though it were music. His family surrounded him through every session, cheering, clapping, encouraging. Some days were victories. The first time he stood with support. The first time he formed a full sentence. The first time he remembered a friend's name. Other days were crushing, when he fell back into silence, when his body betrayed him, when frustration left him in tears. But even then, he fought, and those around him fought with him. One afternoon, his sister placed his guitar in his lap. His fingers trembled against the strings, too weak to press them firmly. Still, he tried. The sound was uneven, almost broken, but it was music. His mother cried openly, kissing his forehead as his friends clapped and cheered. "You'll play again," one of them whispered. "I know you will." The hospital staff, who had once spoken only in cautious tones, began to use new words: progress, improvement, determination. They were inspired not only by his recovery, but by the unwavering love that surrounded him. Some admitted quietly that they had never seen a case quite like his, where faith and devotion seemed to bend the rules of possibility. In time, Daniel's voice grew stronger. He laughed for the first time in months, a sound that filled the ward and brought nurses running just to hear it. That laugh reminded everyone of who he was before the accident. The boy with a song for every moment. The boy whose joy could light up a room. And if you followed his journey until now, if you felt the weight of his struggle and the power of his return, this is the perfect moment to show your support. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share this story. By doing so, you help us continue bringing these real miracles and emotional journeys to life. Stories that remind us of hope, love, and the strength of the human spirit. Because Daniel's story was never about despair. It was about resilience, about the power of a community refusing to give up, about a young man who, against all odds, refused to let silence define him. And though the road ahead remained long, the direction was finally clear. He was not moving backwards. He was stepping, slowly but surely, toward a life that had waited patiently for his return. Months passed, and the hospital no longer felt like a cage. For Daniel, it became a place of transformation. He relearned the simplest movements, piecing together fragments of the life he had lost. Every day he grew stronger, standing longer, speaking clearer, smiling wider. His laughter returned, still shaky but just as radiant as before. And yet, despite the progress, there were moments when the weight of his journey pressed heavily upon him. Late at night, when the lights dimmed and the halls quieted, he often lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts wandered back to the accident, to the sudden darkness that had swallowed him, to the strange half-dream world he had lived in for 6 long months. He remembered voices, his mother singing, his sister reading, his friends playing guitar. They had reached him when no one believed it was possible. But he also remembered something else, a presence he could not explain, a whisper in the dark that had told him again and again, "It's not your time." He shared this with his family one evening. They were gathered around his bed, celebrating the milestone of him walking 5 steps on his own. "When I was gone," he said slowly, "I wasn't alone. I felt something, like someone was with me, pulling me back. I can't explain it, but I know it wasn't just medicine that saved me." His mother wept, holding his hand tighter, while his sister whispered that she believed him. His friends exchanged looks, awed but speechless. Doctors listened politely, then redirected the conversation to his therapy. Science had its limits, and some truths could not be measured on charts. But for Daniel and those who loved him, the mystery was undeniable. His survival was more than improbable. It was miraculous. Still, questions lingered. Why had he survived when so many others did not? Why had he been given a second chance? He wondered if there was a purpose waiting for him, something beyond simply recovering. Perhaps the accident was not the end of his story, but the beginning of a new one. As his discharge day approached, excitement and uncertainty filled the air. He stood by the window, gazing at the world outside, the city lights glowing in the distance, people walking quickly through the streets, living their lives. Soon he would join them. But he knew he was not the same man who entered the hospital months ago. He carried scars, both visible and invisible. He carried a story that could never be erased. On the morning he left, nurses and doctors lined the hallway, clapping as he walked slowly, supported but determined. His mother cried openly, his sister cheered, and his friends recorded every step. The boy who had been silent for 6 months was walking into the world again, his voice, his spirit, and his life reclaimed. And yet, as he paused at the hospital doors, he looked back. His eyes lingered at the place where he had almost slipped away forever. He said softly, "I don't know why I was given this chance, but I won't waste it." What came next remained unwritten. Would he return to music, to the life he once dreamed of? Or would this miracle push him towards something new, something greater? The only certainty was that Daniel's story was not finished. Because sometimes survival is not the ending, it is only the first chapter of a story still waiting to be told.